story. And finally tonight, not everyone is able to find sobriety. Jamel Moore and Timothy Dean both died of drug overdoses at the West Hollywood home of political donor Ed Buck. Jamel Moore passed in 2017 and Timothy Dean died 2 years later. This month, Ed Buck, the man charged with causing their deaths, faces trial. He has been charged with providing the drugs, enticement to travel for prostitution, distribution of methamphetamine, and maintaining a drug den. Joining me now with more is attorney Nana Gyamfi. She is co-counsel to the victims' families. Nana, I really appreciate your joining us once again on this program, and I just want to take a moment to note to our viewers that some of our conversation may not be appropriate for all of our viewers. Nana Gyamfi, welcome back.
Thank you so very much. Glad to be here. Thank you for continuing to lift up this really important story.
It is a really important story. We have dedicated 2 entire episodes to this situation. But for those who have not been following it closely, can you just briefly remind us what the allegations are when it comes to Ed Buck and these 2 men?
So Ed Buck came to light beyond what was happening in West Hollywood in 2017, as you pointed out, at the death of Jamel Moore. At that time, the sheriffs ruled it an accidental overdose, basically saying that Jamel did this to himself. And we in the community, myself, Jasmine Canick, Jamel Moore's mother, Letitia Nixon, Jerome Kitchen, who is someone who is in the community, and other community folks, we were clear that there was more here than met the eye. We started getting reached out to by other people who were saying, you know what, I know Ed Buck. I was invited into the apartment by Ed Buck, and I also was abused by Ed Buck with the furnishing of drugs in amounts and in ways that were beyond what I had consented to. In some cases, I was unconscious. I had no idea that he was going to inject me, woke up with a needle in my arm. And so we began to collect the information that people were giving us about what happened, took that to the sheriff's department, and it was very difficult to get some kind of movement. We predicted at that time, based upon the numbers of people who had come forward, that there was going to be another person who was killed by Ed Buck's actions. And that, in fact, happened. Unfortunately, Timothy Dean was killed and in 2019, in January. And then there was a third person who is testifying today, actually, in the federal criminal trial against Ed Buck, who was nearly killed, was able to escape. And it was only at that point that we had these federal charges, as well as the county, the district attorney's office in Los Angeles filing a single charge against Ed Buck. But we're in the federal criminal case right now.
And I do want to make it clear, we reached out to Ed Buck's attorneys to see if they wanted to provide comment. We have not heard back from them at the time of this taping. They have claimed in the past that these are claims that are fueled by so-called racism, that he, in fact, was helpful and supportive to those dealing with addiction. From the reports that I've been reading, there has been a lot of evidence presented so far that might well contradict that. Can you tell us a little bit, Nana, about what has been talked about, what has been shared in court to date?
So it's really been shocking. We knew from talking to folks who had dealt with Ed Buck, talking to these young men, that Ed Buck videotaped. We knew that he took pictures. What was presented was 2,400 videos that were taken from Ed Buck, showing him repeatedly injecting folks who are unconscious, sexually assaulting folks who are unconscious. Like you can see in the video, these people are not conscious. They were not allowed to be played in terms of the words. The court insisted that the N-word be used instead of the actual term itself, and that others not even be played because they were so offensive in terms of the racial epithets and other demeaning words that were used by Ed Buck against these black gay men, who were the victims of his abuse. It really is, it's sickening. I mean, there's no other way to describe what it is that we have seen. The text messages, which include words directly from Ed Buck, again, making it clear that what we had in this situation was not just a drug den, that in fact, there were acts of torture that were happening, that there was sexual assault and sexual abuse that was happening, among other types of horrors. And so it's been good, in the one hand, to be able to really allow and have the survivors be able to express what happened to them. Because as you remember, Alex, people didn't believe them. They were acting like, oh, these people are just out for a buck, or, et cetera, et cetera. And it turns out that no, actually, what they were describing was the tip of the iceberg of what the videos and the text messages show was really happening.
Nana, I can only imagine that what the families of both Timothy Dean and Jamel Moore would want most is to have their loved ones back, and sadly that can't be the case. What are they hoping for as an outcome in this trial?
So in the criminal trial, the family members, and Letitia Nixon is here, as well as Timothy Dean's sisters, Joyce Jackson and Joanne Campbell. And what they're looking for is a conviction. They're looking for Ed Buck to be convicted on all counts, including the counts that allege that he furnished drugs to Jamel and to Timothy, and that they died as a result. And so that's their hope on the criminal side. On the civil side, they both have filed civil cases. Those cases have been on hold. Those cases are another attempt to hold Ed Buck accountable for his actions that resulted in the death of their loved ones. And we'll see. I mean, I'm very interested in seeing how the jury looks at this case, because it's not just about, is Ed Buck, a torturer? Has Ed Buck sexually abused people, etc.? I mean, you got to look specifically at the charges. And it's clear the defense has, weaponized HIV and AIDS and somehow made it the fault of people with HIV and AIDS, that they were victimized by Ed Buck. He has weaponized, the health conditions of Timothy Dean. Almost reminded me of George Floyd, in that trial and what happened there. And so it's going to be interesting to see, how does a jury take this information, and whether or not they in fact hold Ed Buck accountable.
Yeah, and from what I've been hearing, please correct me if I'm wrong, some say that this trial could be wrapped up by the end of this week, but everything that you're saying right now points to, beyond Ed Buck, there are much bigger, more systemic problems that are out there. Nana, we just have a few moments left with you, but what would you like to see happen on just kind of a broader societal level to make sure that nothing like these two deaths ever happens again?
Black Lives Matter is a basic rallying cry, but it's what we're talking about, the humanity of Black people. These survivors all talk about, at some point, going to the West Hollywood Sheriff Station and saying, hey, this has happened to me. And they were shooed away. They were treated like trash, like they were disposable, as if their lives did not matter. And when people know that there's a population of folks, and usually it's Black folks, whose lives are disposable in the mind of society, then they attack those people. And they do so with impunity. And so, as you know, Alex, I worked also with Margaret Prescott on the Grim Sleeper cases with Lonnie Franklin. Same notion, right? Just a different population. But this idea that there are people who people describe as trash. We had a council person describe them as hustlers, right? And therefore, they don't matter. And that's how you end up in this situation. It is not, we may not be the ones causing the harm, but we certainly, in turning away and acting like this doesn't matter, are enabling the harm, each and every one of us.
Nana Gyamfi, thank you so much for your time and for your work. We deeply appreciate it.